Hello and welcome to the 11th episode of this series, which starts out with me doing a little Excel housekeeping. As I have been in the last few, I'm going to delete these green things from the past and move on to the future here. And this episode's going to be a little different. We've fallen into kind of a cadence of doing all the different pieces, and that's kind of over and done with now. So it's almost time to go on to start implementing some of the mechanics of board play. However, instead of doing that at first, I'm going to go back and tie up some loose ends, focusing on what's in this spreadsheet. So the first thing is the little bit of housekeeping of putting knight into its own class, but I'm going to go beyond that and do some things that have kind of bothered me for a little while here. And first of all, I need to get knight into its own class before doing that. And I'm even going to forgo cleaning up this method, which I'm still not a huge fan of, in order to look at some of these things that have been hanging around for a long time that I've never really moved over to the but I'll worry about later and kind of meant to get around to refactoring oriented sort of thing. So I'm going to warm up with something that's sort of relatively easy and workmanlike, which is to create a project. And, you know, this is starting to shape up into something resembling an actual application, so it's probably time to get two different solutions here. So that's something easy to do. And, you know, each time I do this series, I haven't looked at this code in a while. There's nothing going on behind the scenes. I'm not cheating or studying crib notes or anything like that. So what you're seeing is actually me, you know, in spans of a week or more at a time, looking at this code base, saying, what was I doing again? Oh, yeah. So it helps to get warmed up, and maybe this is a good practice for you as well, because you're often doing maintenance programming or whatever it is where you're not necessarily in the same code day in and day out. So for me, this is easy. How can I get my mind back into the mindset of doing this particular application and working in this domain? One good way to do that is to start moving classes around and figuring out where they need to be. And there's a certain cadence to it, I guess, that's a little satisfying. There's an element of grunt work here, which I frequently preach against. You don't want to be doing grunt work, be smart. Sometimes it's kind of unavoidable. Moving classes around, doing find and replace type activities like I'm doing here. And frankly, this might be somewhat of a boring episode because I am doing a number of things like this, changing namespaces and refactorings that involve kind of going through a lot of files and changing stuff. So what I am doing now is going through the process of cleaning up these namespaces and references and trying to get everything to build. So I have to go in and actually add a reference in the test project to the production project, or things won't work. And now I'm going to have various compilation problems that have to do with the namespaces. So yeah, I've got an incorrect namespace up there at the top that I'm going to have to correct. And I think I went back in here after a minute at least and did the find and replace, because this namespace is now defunct. And I think what you're seeing in here, for what it's worth, I discovered halfway through filming this and paused it. I had something running that was hooking Control M, and you might see me type O's in here. I sort of routinely do Control MO and Control ML, which in Visual Studio is a handy shortcut that collapses everything and expands everything. And when that's taken away, you see me look like an idiot by typing O and L all the time. So there was a point where I was getting distracted by this, so I actually paused. I never figured out what process was hooking it. I just rebooted the computer, and everything was back to normal. So that might be why you're seeing a bit of hesitation here. But anyway, I'm going through and making these corrections. And as I'm doing, yeah, there's another O. I hadn't quite figured it out yet at this point and done the reboot. But another thing that's going on as I'm kind of going into these classes one by one, instead of just doing the find and replace all, I'm kind of taking inventory real quick as I look through here at what these test classes look like that I haven't looked like in a while for the purpose of some of the refactoring that I'm going to do. So I have everything building now. I finally got done with that, and I can mark these items green. And actually, I noticed after the fact that there's a duplicate here with production code not in its own project under but I'll worry about later. Never wound up marking that green, but I should go back and do that. So what I'm going to do next is come in here and address this default board size problem. So I'm going to take a look, and I think I took a couple of swipes at this before I figured out that I had search in all open documents rather than in solution. But what I wanted to see is all these different places where I have this default board size. And I knew as I was doing it I didn't like it, but it's time to actually go back and address it and stop procrastinating. You might not view this as a problem, but I do. I ruthlessly eliminate duplication. And the fact that in all these different test classes there's this local constant called default board size is a problem because, yeah, it's not real likely to happen given what we all know about chess, but you ask yourself a question like, well, what if we wanted to change the default board size at some point? You don't want the answer to that question, to that what if, to be, well, I'd open a bunch of files or do a find and replace, you know, the dry principle, if you're familiar with it, don't repeat yourself. What it really comes down to, I remember reading this in The Pragmatic Programmer, is not even just that you don't want to copy and paste code, it's that all knowledge in your system, in your domain, in your application, even including things like config files and databases, all knowledge should have one point where it's defined. So you should not be defining concepts in multiple places. You really want to avoid that, and that's what I want to get to here. It might seem trivial that it's in a test class, but everything is a maintenance pain, and if you're writing these unit tests, if you're practicing TDD, they're part of your maintenance, so you shouldn't just kind of shrug that off. It should get addressed. So that's what I'm doing here, and I am, this is all refactoring. So I'm not looking to write failing tests and then have them pass. I'm just, I mean, I am creating failing tests by altering these unit test classes, but there's not the red-green refactor cycle here. The entirety of this episode is just refactoring. So what I'm doing here is I'm figuring out, okay, I've decided on a scheme where, you know what, I'm passing this parameter in all the time, and it's 8 all the time, and that should be telling me something about my design, which is there's this capability to have this concept of default parameter values, I think was introduced in .NET 4, I want to say, and I'm going to take advantage of that. So I am going to be opinionated about what the default board size should be, and I think that's okay because what I've seen sort of organically here is that I make it 8 everywhere. So clearly there's something driving me to 8, and that something happens to be the fact that chessboard are actually 8 by 8. But I've seen sort of forged in the fires of experience here that I'm constantly passing 8 to this method, so why not be opinionated and set it to be 8? But what we're not going to go and do is put in a magic number 8 in all these different methods. Since I can't define it only once in the abstract method up in piece, I have to define it over and over again, so I sure want to introduce a constant. So just off the cuff, I decided to introduce that constant in the board coordinate class, since that seemed related to board size. I will introduce a spoiler here and admit that I had completely forgotten that at one point many episodes ago I had defined a class called board, and I think that's actually a much better place for it, so a lot later in this episode I go in and refactor that to actually be in the board class, that constant. So this is grunt work now. What I'm doing is I'm going and finding all these places where I have this default board size being passed in, and I'm amending these classes to take this default parameter, and I'm just going to delete it. I'm going to stop specifying this because everywhere here I'm passing in 8. Sure, I've defined it as a constant in the class, makes the tests more readable, and it eliminates duplication at least within these test classes, but now I'm going back and completely eliminating it. So there is exactly one place when I'm done with this in the application the default board size is defined. So the answer to that question I mentioned earlier is going to become a lot nicer, where what happens if we want to change the default board size? Well, now the answer to that is going to be you find where that constant is defined and change it from 8 to whatever, and then everything in the application works and life is good. And another thing I'm noticing here is that I didn't do it while I was actually implementing this. I didn't really notice the test method names, but I just noticed that I had baked into some of the earlier tests, when there's a default size of 8, I should probably go back and change those test names. And that's, interestingly, that's something that that you'll often overlook. I am a big advocate of not putting code comments in methods unless they're on a public API that's going to be consumed by other developers and you're putting in doc comments. The reason for this being the comments just pretty much always rot. You diligently comment your method, explaining what it's doing, explaining your preconditions and variants and all that sort of stuff. Then somebody comes along, either you or somebody else, and nobody really reads the comments very often. So you change the method, you forget to update the comment, and the comments get out of date. The one place where I deviate from that these days is still going to be in the test method names, because your test methods, in my opinion, are the only documentation your code base needs, at least from an internal perspective. As I said, if you're writing an API, you probably want to have some documentation for your users, but this is all internal implementation. My test methods are telling you what my code does. They're communicating my intention, which means that this is like your system documentation, your test method names, so it's important to be diligent about those. When you are changing the way a unit test behaves and it has a very descriptive name like the ones I give here, it's important to change the test method name accordingly. I messed up. We can learn from my mistakes here. Hopefully I go back and review this in an episode 12 that at least goes into the to-do list if it doesn't get done. That said, I'm sort of eating time here while I go through this rather tedious process of eliminating these default board sizes. One thing I'll mention here, since you're getting a look at it, is I'm employing a technique that I think I learned about originally in Michael Feather's book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code, called Lean on the Compiler. So rather than going in and one by one deleting, say, all these default board sizes in here, I actually delete the constant where it's defined, and that sort of creates a fail-fast scenario where when I delete the constant, I get these red squigglies saying, hey, you're not compiling. If you do it in the opposite order, maybe I forget to delete one, for the simple fact that with the default parameter being specified, I can specify that parameter not. So if I forget to delete one of those default board sizes, it will still compile and I won't see it. Now I'm doing a double check to make sure I've really gotten rid of all of them, which I have. So it's only defined in one place, and it's only used as the default parameter value in those methods. So I've successfully gotten rid of default board size, and now I'm checking for the constant 8 because I had that magic number passed in some early places. Now I see this here, right? There's this constant int board size, and this is where I had the aha moment. Oh, this is probably a better place for default board size to be defined. I mean, board size is already defined here, and if you're considering conceptual scope of what you're doing, board coordinate is a thing that defines position on the board. It would be unaware of board size, I would think. Just to me, the semantics of this make a lot more sense to define default board size as a property of board. So now that I've done that, I'm going to have some compilation problems. There go my squigglies. So instead of using a brute force kind of approach here, what I'll do is go through entire solution, and if I can get the pasting right, I will replace this with board.default board size. And that works. I think I'm going to do a build here to make sure this is still working. And the ncrunch tests are dark green. So that's another thing I kind of haven't mentioned at all during this, but rest assured, I was, during all of this refactoring, constantly looking at the dots to make sure I wasn't making anything red. And in fact, you're going to see something I'm going to do here that'll be new to this series at the end that I feel is important, because this is a fairly large-scale refactoring. Something you'll notice here, it took me a while, and I eventually got fairly annoyed by this. I don't know what's going on with this plugin that I have. It's usually one of my best friends in Visual Studio, where you see the squigglies for whatever class is responsible for non-compiling. But this plugin seems to be having some trouble here, and it has, throughout the course of this, there they are, giving me these false positives about non-compiling. So you'll see me do Control-Shift-B, and in the bottom there's the build succeeded. I keep reassuring myself because I see these squigglies that the project is actually building. This was a source of some annoyance. But what I'm doing here is going through, once again, all of these classes to sort of inspect and look for opportunities to refactor. And what I'm looking for is, I think it turned out to be in rook or bishop test. There was one where I didn't have this nicely defined get moves from, or maybe two. So you can, perfect timing. I am going to duplicate this pattern that I introduced after maybe 2 or 3 of these test classes, where I see that I am duplicating this possible moves kind of over and over again. So everywhere I'm doing target.get moves from new board coordinate 2, 2. So why don't I define that up front and just use it and cut these tests down by a line each. And, you know, I've beat on this point a lot, but everywhere you can save duplication, by all means do it. I think it's certainly worth these refactoring passes, and it might seem that I'm sort of chasing small things, but this series of small things is what keeps your code base clean. And beyond that, it's the discipline. It's the idea that you've got this red-green refactor, and you don't want to give short shrift to refactor. So I frequently will go through, you know, in this case, I've implemented a bunch of pieces and haven't done a lot of refactoring. Now I'm spending a whole 18 minutes or whatever this turned out to be, where I'm doing nothing but making the code base better. And I'm going through and saying, does this make semantic sense? Do I like where this constant is located? Do I like the name of this? Did I pick up something new and helpful that I was doing that was an improvement, like what you're seeing here? I kind of went through this progression where I said, oh, well, let me define this default coordinate instead of this logic of get moves from new coordinate over and over again. And then after doing rook, I think bishop or whatever came next, I had an even better idea to eliminate more duplication. So now I'm going back and I'm being consistent. Forget about this default coordinate. Let's go back and introduce the improvement. Let's eliminate this line of duplication. Here I am getting annoyed by the false positive non-compile again. But let's eliminate this line of duplication. Let's make everything consistent. Let's make everything as pretty as possible. So I'm finishing up here. I can't get rid of the duplication in this last method. My tests are dark green, which I'm happy about. I can get rid of that line that wasn't being executed, getting false positives again, but when I do Control-Shift-B for build, everything works. Now I'm going to really explicitly make sure rebuild all succeeded. False positives went away for the moment. But what I'm going to do here is I've sort of like kind of violently gone through here and done a bunch of find and replace and all sorts of other stuff. I want to kind of make good and sure that everything's passing and not just relying on the dots on an individual basis. I want to see that all these tests are passing after sort of a large-scale refactor. Took me a minute here, and this tells you how infrequently I use the MS test runner instead of ncrunch. I don't even know where to find it. Don't know why that window wasn't popping up. I would think when you run the tests it would pop it. I eventually figured out that, yeah, it's over here. There we go. So all of my tests are passing. There are no red tests, so I feel good about the refactor. I'm going to go mark up this spreadsheet, and then I will see you next time on the next installment of this series with maybe a little more refactoring.